everyone. Welcome to the Faith Focus Weekly Discipleship Podcast. My name is Kevin Rogness, and I'm the Discipleship Director here at Faith Covenant Church. Thank you so much for watching or listening today, and I want to remind you that it's helpful to subscribe to make sure that you don't miss any of our weekly episodes. I'd also really appreciate if you could leave a review so that I know what we can do better and what we're doing well already. So if you can do those things, that would be great. As you probably know if you've been watching recently, we are in the midst of a series of episodes about church history. It's so important that we know our histories so that we can learn from the past. We can make sure, hopefully, that we can avoid making certain mistakes. And it helps us to follow Jesus more completely and more thoroughly and more accurately when we know where we're coming from. This call to understand history is laced throughout the Bible. It's usually phrased in terms of knowing the law, but the law includes the history of the people. Throughout the Old Testament, God is continually telling the people, remember where you came from, in a variety of different ways. There are things that are structured so that the people are constantly leaving physical reminders of actions that God took, so that they can be reminded to tell these stories of their people to future generations. So it's very important to know our history. It is a biblical call. To do that, as you know, I've been using this couple of books. This one's called The Story of Christianity, Volume 1. Today is the last day of going through Volume 2, and then the next 3 episodes are going to focus on the second volume. So I think it's a wonderful resource. This is a very high-level overview, and we're only doing a very brief summary of this book. So I strongly encourage you to delve into the different parts of history that you find are interesting. Today we're going to be talking about the beginning of the Colonial era of Christianity. And like the Crusades last week, this is another difficult part of church history to talk about, because much of the church was complicit in some very disturbing things. So I just want to let you know that up front. I also just want to say real quick that this is probably going to be a shorter episode, so I'm giving you a little bit of a break this week. Next week we'll be delving into the Reformation, which starts to get really interesting. There's a whole lot going on there. It's going to be difficult to keep it concise. But yeah, this week is a shorter episode. So this era of colonial Christianity, as they call it in the book, really kind of begins in the mid-1400s and kind of lasts through the late 1700s. So the mid-15th century up towards the end of the 18th century. And it's really focused on 2 European nations and their explorations around the world. So at that time, both Spain and Portugal were really looking for influence, and they've ended up looking outwards and exploring more of the world. Now, of course, the areas that they ended up exploring already had people living in them. It is, however, understandable to discuss their explorations as discoveries, in the sense that they were discovering lands that the European peoples had previously not known about. So when I use that language of discovery or exploration, that is being fully aware that there were people living and thriving in those areas being discovered or explored. So I just wanted to put that out there. So again, Portugal and Spain were rapidly starting to really become seafaring nations and really exploring as much as they could. And then, of course, Spain funded an expedition in 1492 led by Christopher Columbus that discovered the New World, as it was known at the time. He basically landed on the island that we know today as Hispaniola, which is the nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So it wasn't the discovery of like the North American continent or the South American continent, though those two were very quickly explored and discovered by Europeans not long thereafter. So that, of course, was a seismic change to what Europeans knew about the world, what Christians at the time knew about the world. This was an entirely unknown land by people that claimed to be Christians up until that point. So this was a major discovery. Very quickly, it became a very problematic endeavor in the sense that the ways that Spanish explorers and colonizers and settlers were treating the native populations. It was, in a word, barbaric. Spanish settlers used all kinds of different means to basically come into control of the land. In some cases it was unfair treaties, in some cases it was outright war and violence. Part of the issue was not necessarily intentional, but the diseases that the Europeans brought into the New World, like smallpox, was also devastating to native populations. So there was just this huge confluence of really terrible things that people were doing to take over these new lands. There was a lot of subjugation of the native people that were already living there and forcing them essentially into slave labor. Then, once many of the native populations had died, they began importing slave labor from Africa, and that's how the slave trade began in the New World. Certainly slavery had existed in Africa and other places prior to that, but the beginning was kind of in this time frame in the early 1500s that began happening. Also in this era, the Spanish settlers or colonizers or conquistadores, as it's sometimes known in Spanish, they were often coming into conflict with the Spanish monarchy. So as people got over across the Atlantic Ocean and settled or colonized some of these areas, they were doing so very violently in many cases, and sometimes when word got back to the Spanish monarchy would say, hey, slow down, you're going too far, you're doing too much. And so the Spanish monarchy did try to kind of check their power. However, it was an ocean away. There wasn't a lot that they could do to enforce some of those rules. So there were some times where the Spanish monarchy did try to put laws in place to slow down some of these abuses that were happening and put an end to them, but there just wasn't enough ability to enforce some of those laws that were put in place. An example of that was Christopher Columbus himself. Later, after his first voyage, on later voyages, he was known for very brutally subjugating the people on the island of Hispaniola, which is, again, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Very brutal. There is a lot of sexual violence, a lot of just very brutal things. So much so that he was actually, for a time, deposed and taken back to Spain in chains to kind of face the music to an extent. He was essentially let go and not charged for his crimes, but that is a part of history that we don't often talk about. We often only talk about Columbus as the person who discovered the New World. But he was known for being pretty brutal in many cases. So, along the same time, the Pope gave the Spanish crown authority over church matters in the New World. And so, as a result, Spanish churches in the New World were essentially being given bishops who were chosen by the state. So the state, or the Spanish crown, was essentially choosing who was in charge of the churches in the New World. This created an interesting tension where, because they were kind of appointed by secular rulers, they were largely, the church in the New World was in many ways fairly separate from the influence of the Pope in Rome. And so they were kind of developing on their own and doing their own thing. They were still known as being part of the Catholic Church, and they were still technically under the authority of the Pope. But there was a lot of autonomy that they had in the churches in the New World. There was also a lot of missionary activity that opened up. Some of this missionary activity was not done in an ideal sense. Some of these missionaries were really just going in for profit and power, but other missionaries did go in with a genuine heart to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. So There were missionaries from the Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit orders, and often it was these missionaries and monks and such that really interacted with the native peoples and really ended up siding with the native peoples oftentimes. I previously mentioned that there were occasions where the Spanish monarchy tried to implement laws that were fairer and kinder to the native populations. Those laws were often the result of some of these missionaries, like the Jesuits or the Dominicans or the Franciscans. So they were often the ones pleading the cases of the natives. This also created a tension where the bishops, the main leaders of the churches in the New World, were often allied with the secular powers that appointed them, but the more local level parish priests and ministries were more kind of the leaders of the people. And so the church kind of ended up having two faces in the New World, in the areas of Spanish influence, where the main leadership was loyal to the crown and to secular power, but the more grassroots leadership and Christian leadership was maybe more for the people and wanting reform and wanting much better treatment to correct the abuses that they saw happening. So there was a lot of these tensions that were happening at this time. So some of the parts of the churches condoned the oppression, other parts were opposing it. Later, once we got into the 19th century, which is largely way ahead of what we're talking about today, but it's worth mentioning that once we started to see some of these independence movements in some of these countries in the Central and South Americas, it was often the powerful bishops that wanted to stay in alignment and in the authority of the colonizing countries and the crown, and it was more the local church leaders that kind of were with the people wanting independence. So that was kind of a tension that lasted for several centuries in the New World. So a system called encomiendas also developed during this time. Theoretically, it wasn't slavery, at least that's what the people who were implementing it said. The idea, in theory, was that the encomiendas were entrusting, which is kind of what the translation of encomienda is, entrusting local native populations into the care of people that would then guide them into Christian doctrine. That was the theoretical idea. In practice, it was essentially slavery. In some cases, it was worse than slavery because there was very little incentive to do anything good for the people that it was subjugating. So that system was developing. There were protests by various Christian leaders against those systems. That had some effect in 1542. That was a year where there was some remarkable legislation and laws put in place by the Spanish crown. But again, as I said earlier, some of those things were largely ignored by the people in the New World. So, things were particularly violent, again, like I said, in the Caribbean, where Columbus had kind of first arrived and made landfall. Other leaders that came in were similarly violent and brutal against native populations. A lot of plagues and disease that came in. There was a lot of sexual violence. There was a lot of military violence. It was just really not a great situation at all. And it was in 1502 that some of the first shipments of African slaves came over into the Caribbean to start working on the farms there. Those farms were very profitable. Sugarcane especially was one of the major exports to the European nations in essence. But again, it was a profit that was taken at a tremendous human cost. Just incredibly brutal stuff there that, again, in some ways the churches was complicit, in other ways other people within the church were calling it out and trying to bring reform and justice to these situations. Also in this general time frame, we get people like Cortez, who marched into Mexico and into some of the areas known as the Aztec Empire. Ostensibly, Cortez claimed to be a Christian leader, and in many places he did seek to destroy the idol worship of the native populations that he came in contact with. But realistically, his goal was more about profit and power. He did certainly get rid of idol worship in some areas, but in other areas he made alliances with certain powerful tribes in local areas that he needed to have on his side in order to defeat other tribes. The tribes he made alliances with, he didn't make any effort to get rid of idol worship in their tribes. And so, essentially, he claimed to be kind of advocating for Christianity and stomping out idol worship in the lands that they were marching into. However, he did so selectively. When it was beneficial to not tamp out idol worship, he didn't. So he was really more focused on power and profit. A lot of these quote-unquote explorers that were coming into these lands heard local legends of things like golden cities like El Dorado. And so that kind of sent them onto bloodthirsty quests to find these cities for the sake of gold. So there was really a lot of economic pressure to do these things versus any sort of genuine zeal for Christianity, for spreading the gospel. Certainly other missionaries came along the way and did have a genuine zeal for the people and for spreading the gospel, but the big names that we hear about that were really running the show, they were really looking to influence their own power and their own profit. So lots of very problematic things. Over time, Spanish forces moved from some of the landing areas kind of in Central and South America and started moving north into what is now known as Texas, California, New Mexico, those areas. That kind of came later into like the 16th and 17th centuries. And in some of those areas, some of the missionaries actually had better success in establishing a foothold there and setting up missions, some of which the ruins are still around today. So that was kind of happening, expansion northwards into what is today modern-day United States of America. That's why there's still a lot of Spanish influence in kind of Southwest America today. So up until like 1562, so the mid-1500s, the Spanish had kind of started exploring Florida. Not a whole lot of exploration there. They'd kind of established a couple footholds there, but hadn't done much until 1562, when the French were starting to show up and starting to try to set up colonies in the area. And this was very upsetting to the Spanish, not just because they were French, but also because they were French Protestants. Because some of this was starting to happen after the Reformation, which we'll talk about next week. But when French Protestants were in the area, that set up a lot of conflict, because they were having conflict on the mainland Europe, and now they were having conflict in the New World over Protestantism versus Catholicism. So those tensions were spilling over from Europe into the Americas, and so the Spanish essentially took over Florida and kind of claimed that area for a long time. Eventually they started getting competition from English claims from the British, and then eventually they ceded land to what is now the United States of America. I think that was 1819. I didn't remember to write that date down. So all kinds of competition. The earliest eras of the colonial era were mainly Spanish, but eventually other European nations did, of course, start settling as well. So again, like I said, there were a good number of missionaries that were doing genuine gospel-centered work with very genuine motivations, and they were often the ones trying to reform and do better for the native peoples. The Jesuits in particular were very noted. At one point, the Spanish crown even expelled Jesuit missionaries from all of their lands, theoretically expelled them, basically forbid them from their lands, because the Jesuits were so often on the side of the local native indigenous populations. So that was all tension that was occurring And and then eventually the Spanish also moved kind of south and west in South America as well, into areas known today as like Peru, Argentina, Chile, conquering the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire had been huge and spanned a ton of territory, but by the time the Spanish really came in to really take over, the early encounters with the Spanish brought smallpox, and so smallpox was already having a major effect on the Incan Empire by the time the Spanish really came in to invade. And then also the Incan Empire had been having internal tensions and civil wars. So when the Spanish forces really did come to take over, it was kind of the prime time for them to be able to do so due to tensions already existing within the Inca Empire and their own lack of biological immunity to the diseases that were coming over. So a lot of this was going on, and it really was a dark time for the church. In all of this, the Pope basically was agreed on in the Christian world at the time by many people, not all, but many. They basically argued that as the Pope was the representative of God on earth, the Pope had the authority to just grant land around the world to Christian nations. That was kind of their justification for what was really a power grab. And so for a long time, they kind of made a line on a map and said, okay, Spain, you get everything west of this line. Portugal gets everything east of this line. So now we're going to kind of move into talking about Portugal, which Portugal, if you know your maps, you know that Portugal is a fairly small nation kind of on the western coast of Europe. It's basically completely surrounded by Spain. Because it's surrounded by Spain, Portugal kind of had to go outward into the ocean to have any sort of chance of establishing their own national identity, or to expand, or to have trade. And so Portugal, like Spain, was kind of one of the early explorers of the seas. Sailors of Portugal began looking along the the west coast of Africa to try to find a way around Africa to get to the Orient, as it was known. Modern-day China, Japan, India, etc. People in Europe knew about those areas, and there had been trade for thousands and thousands of years with those regions, with India and China, and that trade was profitable. However, it was very difficult and very slow, because all of that trade had to happen on land, because they didn't have the ships to go around Africa, and they didn't even know they could go around Africa for a very, very long time. And so over time, this, though, began to get very complicated, not just because it was a long and difficult journey over land, but also because with the rise of Muslim rule in many of these territories, they now could not necessarily get through, or they would have to pay large amounts of money to Muslim, the Ottoman Empire, for example. And so towards the end of the 15th century, the end of the 1400s, the Portuguese were starting to wonder, can we get around Africa? Is there a way around to get to the Orient so that we can do trade over the ocean instead of going over land? There were also rumors that they didn't know for sure, but there have been rumors of a place called Ethiopia where there was rumored to be a Christian nation there. And so they kind of wanted to find a way to get to that, because if they could create an alliance with this rumored Ethiopian Christian nation that they had heard of, they thought that that could be an ally against the Muslims. So they began exploring along the west coast, and in 1487, Portuguese sailors did reach the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope at the very southern tip, and they started to see, oh, now we can start going north on the other side of Africa. So that was a major discovery. Then 10 years later, in 1497, a sailor named Vasco da Gama, he sailed around to the east side of Africa and then sailed across the Indian Ocean and made it all the way to India. And that was a game changer for the European continent, because that meant that trade with India and China no longer had to be by land. You could bypass all of that and do it much more quickly and much more safely. So that was a major discovery. I mentioned a moment ago that the Pope had kind of set a line and gave the west side of the line to the Spanish to go kind of settle or explore or whatever, and then gave everything east of that line to the Portuguese. So that included Africa, and that included places in Asia as well. So in theory, the Pope was just giving land, even though there were plenty of people living in those lands, and realistically, Portugal never had any chance of actually conquering China, India, or all of Africa. So, given that they did not have the ability to take over in Asia, in places like China and India and Japan, Portugal instead decided to just set up really strong trade relations with those nations. And so that's what happened. Portugal established various military bases and cities throughout like India and in different areas, and that helped facilitate a really strong trade economy with the Orient, again, now known as Eastern Asia. So that was happening. At the same time, the Portuguese were also really exploring along the western coast of Africa in particular. They found the mouth of the Congo River in western Africa and thought that maybe this would lead up towards that mythical Christian nation in Ethiopia that they had heard of. That river ended up not going all the way there, but in the process of that exploration, they began to colonize those areas. At first, it started off as respectful alliances of local African kingdoms, but that quickly deteriorated into more violent colonization efforts. So, similar situation that happened with the Spanish in the Americas, in the New World. There was a lot of the church looking the other way or condoning oppression. It just really was, again, not a good situation. As Portugal became more involved in Africa, they also became more involved with the slave trade. And obviously we know the ramifications of that. So that was all happening. And at the same time, too, as the Portuguese were getting better at navigating around Africa, they discovered that the prevailing winds were continually coming off the coast of Africa. So to try to go around Africa, they started actually going further west into the Atlantic Ocean towards South America so that they could kind of get under the winds and go under that way. As the Portuguese went further west so that they could more easily go east by avoiding these winds, the Portuguese actually discovered in the sense that they didn't know about it yet, but there were people living there. They discovered the very eastern edge of South America, where modern-day Brazil is. And that was actually that line that I talked about earlier, where the Portuguese get everything east of it and the Spanish get everything west of it. That part of Brazil was actually east of that line that the Pope had set. So now suddenly the Portuguese had a foothold in the New World that the Pope was willing to grant them. And the Spanish couldn't really dispute that claim because the Pope had said so. So now the Portuguese had a kind of foothold in Brazil and established more colonies, and similar situations happened. Exploitations of the natives, violence, sexual assault, all kinds of things, slave trade, all of these things, kind of the same patterns were going on in Brazil as well. So along the way, again, missionaries came in, notably Jesuit missionaries were going in there. Jesuit missionaries were also really known for heading out east along those Portuguese trade routes into India and China and lots of other places, the Philippines. They often faced distrust with some of the locals, particularly in China. They didn't really trust foreign influence. And so in some cases, the Jesuit priests did face martyrdom. They were killed in some areas, but in some areas they also had a lot of success. Some of those successes of people in Eastern Asia converting to Christianity some of it was genuine, some of it was to try to appease the Portuguese trade. So they thought that it would be economically or politically beneficial for them to convert to Christianity to, in theory, they, in their minds, kind of become subjects of the Portuguese king. So mixed levels of results with the spread of Christianity along those trade routes. Not that Christianity hadn't already gotten there by other means already into Eastern Asia, but this was kind of a new influx of Christian missionary work into Eastern Asia. So in all of this, a lot of these missionaries, similar to what was happening in the Spanish areas of the New World, a lot of the Christian missionaries really began to see how problematic it was, the ways that the Portuguese authorities were treating local indigenous populations. They were really beginning to see the ways that the church was overly connected to secular power and profit, the way the church was overly connected to trade and local economy. And so they were really seeking to reform and seeking a purer expression of the Christian faith. So all of these tensions were happening all around the world now as trade became more and more global. Like I said, some areas were harder to get into than others, but they still were able to get into quite a few of those areas. So as all of this is happening, a lot of this is happening in the 16th century, also known as the 1500s. Also at the same time, there's turmoil in Europe because the Reformation got started, and we're going to talk about the Reformation next week. So many things are happening around the world at this time in relation to Christian history. And then if you look outside of Christian history, there's also a lot of other things. But with our focus looking at church history, what's happening here in particular with this colonization era is the church is really complicit in some really barbaric things that were going on. Barbaric conquest, barbaric thirst for power. Some of it was done in the name of spreading the gospel, but realistically it was more about control and more about gold in many cases, especially in the new world as it was known then. So just some really problematic things. At the same time, of course, like I've said, there were a lot of people who were saying this is not what the Christian faith is supposed to be. We need to do better. So those tensions were all happening all at once, and we're still dealing with those tensions today. So this is an age-old concern in the Christian faith, is how does Christianity interface with economy and with political power? These are questions we have not solved. So yeah, that's a lot to process. I'm going to leave you with that today. So thank you so much for watching and listening. If you have questions, my email address is listed in the show notes, so please feel free to send me a message and let me know what you're wrestling with or what you have questions about. Thank you so much for watching today, and I hope you have a blessed and wonderful day.